Cool. Okay. Well, yeah. So the first question that I start off with, I want to start off with my different guests, is to look at where you sit politically and theologically. So I wonder if we could just begin with looking at where you sit in both of those. I understand that you're theologically, you've had an interesting journey, that you're attending an Anglican church now, and there's been different points along the way, and then politically you're broadly post-liberal, although feel free to correct that and nuance that. Yeah, I just wonder if you could sort of tell the story of how you have come to those positions.
I'll do politics first because it's probably easier. I mean, post-liberal I find such an interesting term because it doesn't really have any content. Liberalism is about maximizing freedom, to be really brutally reductive, which is in itself pretty content free. So what comes after liberalism is a really difficult question, because that's about maximizing the freedom from maximal freedom. So what exactly you fill that space with is pretty much anybody's guess. And I think that's, answering that question is really where we are. But in as much as my politics has a content, it's about asking that question, what does come after the maximization of freedom? Is there a natural order, and if so, how do we discern it, and how do we draw out those patterns from it which are appropriate to us now, rather than just relying blindly on heuristics drawn from traditions which don't apply anymore? Do the old traditions all just should we just return to 1450? I don't know the answer to these questions, but in as much as I have a politics, it's about asking them. I prefer to think of my politics as being about reconstruction rather than being post anything. I tend to get treated as a conservative just by virtue of the fact that I have an interest in history, or an interest in human nature, or an interest in pretty much anything other than the radical individualism these days positions you as a conservative. But I feel like the terrain of conservatism has got so broad that it's become sort of pretty much anything except an extremely narrowly defined orthodoxy, and within that probably needs some sharper definition. So reconstruction, I suppose. But what exactly we go about reconstructing, that really is politics now. That is the content of politics. If we've radically liquefied everything, we've destroyed all the social structures, and we've destroyed all of the assumptions we had about what human nature is, and we've destroyed all of the, we're doing our best to destroy nation states, and we're doing our best to destroy, any form of solidarity that's intermediate between the individual and the absolute. Then what do we replace them with? Unless you believe that we don't need to replace them, which I personally would contest, then what do you replace them with? Post-liberalism, I said once, is what conservatism looks like when there's nothing left to conserve.
Yeah. So
I suppose that would be my understanding of it.
And then theologically,
that's again, there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is broadly Christian. The long answer is sort of fairly heretically Christian in some ways. My local parish is in vacancy at the moment, and we're due a new vicar anytime now. So when that happens, I'm going to have to confess to this new vicar that I've been receiving communion in our local Anglican church, having never actually been confirmed as an Anglican. Because that's kind of awkward, but I suppose I'll find a way of solving that one sooner or later. How I got there relates actually, I suppose, to the question of what you go about conserving when there's nothing left to conserve. I went to a Steiner school. I grew up around anthroposophists, who are a very eccentric, I suppose, group of the esoteric Christian sect founded by Rudolf Steiner and heavily influenced by the theosophists of the 19th century, Madame Blavatsky and all of that lot, which fuses elements of sort of Gnostic influenced esoteric Christianity. They're very keen on Cathars, for example. I know, right? And they're keen on the Cathars, and they have this whole sort of alternate history of the esoteric transmission of knowledge from all the way back to Atlantis, which they believe exists.
Right.
They believe in reincarnation. People come back. You know, the development of a human soul is a trajectory that takes place over numerous lifetimes, not a single one. So obviously death, judgment, heaven and hell takes on quite a different character in that kind of a cosmology, as does sin and redemption. And I mean, without you know, I've not spent time for a while thinking about the sort of Steiner theology in any detail, but it certainly shaped, I suppose, quite a sort of systemic understanding of how the world works. You know, I don't in as much as I don't believe in progress, which I do not. You know, that's probably foundational both to my politics and also to my spirituality, such as it is. I don't think progress is a thing. I think it's a story we tell ourselves about how things work, which has been crucial to the development of the sort of liberal universe and our liberal politics and liberal moral order. But the idea of progress has got to the point now where it's delivering diminishing returns and is actually, you know, for a lot of people actively harmful. And in as much as, and I suppose if you absorb just from childhood the idea that actually, you know, human development takes place over a number of lifetimes, then you're likely to end up with a much more sort of cyclical understanding of how events take place. Steiner education, you know, is very keen to convey the idea of an evolution in human consciousness. You know, we got fairly methodically taught, you know, a sort of sequence of human civilizations. From, I dimly remember that the Sumerians were in there somewhere, and they sort of hinted about Atlantis, but then we didn't really get any mythology from there because there isn't one, or there isn't an extant one anyway, if they did exist. But the Sumerians were in there somewhere, and ancient Egypt. The history of anything was taught from ancient Egypt onwards, you know, whether that was art, architecture, drama, or anything really. They would always say, well, you know, the ancient Egyptians did this, and then the Greeks did that, and the Romans did that, and then you know, Christendom has done this. And so I suppose I've had you know, that gives you, you know, that forms your worldview with a sense of civilizational epochs on really quite a big scale. And I suppose in that context, I've always thought of the entirety of Christendom as a single epoch, you know, whereas for a lot of people, you know, the age of Constantine is quite distinct from the age of, say, I don't know, the late Middle Ages, but, you know, and looked at from the point of view of, you know, the whistle-stop tour through civilizational epochs, it kind of isn't.
Yeah,
so it sort of depends on the scale you're looking at things from. This feels like a very long digression from my theological journey, but it isn't, in the sense that I suppose all of this really informs the point I reached. I suppose sometime in my late 20s, you know, they call it the quarter life crisis. You know, you get to your late 20s and you think, well, what am I actually doing? Various hideous things happened to me, and my worldview, such as it was at the time, fell apart. And I started a business with friends that fell apart horrendously for reasons that I was chiefly responsible for. Various sort of terrible things happened, which broke a number of beliefs I had about how the world worked, and, you know, what constituted, you know, a good next step. And, you know, the best part of the following 10 years I spent kind of trying to, you know, in a personal process of reconstruction, trying to find some way of making sense of the world, you know, out of the ruins of my sort of 20-something idealism. You know, I got married. I stopped farting around doing arty, unremunerative things, and did and retrained as a psychotherapist. Although I've never you know, practiced for any length of time as a psychotherapist, but it was, well, that was hugely helpful in its own right. But, you know, I'm 41 now, and I've reached a point where I have managed to reassemble some sort of meaningful worldview out of the ruins of what happened to me in my 20s, which included a fairly sort of, I suppose, pragmatic sense that worship is important, spirituality is important. I have some questions about the Anglican faith, but it's what we have. And actually that's enough. And, you know, perhaps approaching that with an attitude of humility has some advantages over approaching it with an attitude of disdain and critical effort to destroy.
It's very interesting. There's an interesting strand in both of those things that you've described there, with the reconstruction element and the sort of coming to a realistic view of progress. Is there a sense that therefore how we go about reconstructing, we do that in a more humble and realistic way?
Yes. Yes, and to an extent, I think it follows from that what we currently have is better approached with an attitude of humility. You know, whatever remains that hasn't been dismantled in the name of progress. If you take a concrete example. You know, we have all of these old and beautiful church buildings. You know, and some might say, well, you know, if they're not being used, shouldn't we just turn them all into houses, or you know, knock them down and use and sell off the land, or I don't know. I mean, it's just a church. You know, it's a fairly sort of bog standard as these things go. Sort of, you know, 11th century, I think, Norman church. It's been altered and expanded and repaired and shored up and so on over the years. It's got the stone inscriptions stuck to the walls. You know, it's a fairly standard instance of, you know, it's a sort of palimpsest of parish life, you know, which has accumulated over a millennium. Which, and you know, and on the one hand, it's just a church, it's unremarkable, but on the other hand, that's an astonishing document. And just to sit in that space and to commune with the people of the parish as it currently is, in that space, in the context of everything which has already happened there over the course of 1,000 years, you know, just contemplating that sense of continuity and that sense of a people being together, not just in space now or on any given Sunday, but over time, you know, has itself something of the sacred about it. You know, before you even get to, you know, questions of, you know, death, judgment, heaven or hell. I feel like there's something immensely valuable there. You know, I never want to sort of disintegrate into sort of a utilitarian understanding of Christianity, because, you know, the spiritual values are there and matter. The faith is there and it matters. But there's an enormous amount of sacredness and beauty and value just in that sense of existing, not just in space and in a particular moment, but over time.
Yeah, that's very powerful. You also talked a little bit when we spoke before about an interest in Catholicism and having sort of, as you described, Catholic leanings. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Well, what can I say about that? I mean, I suppose I'm Catholic adjacent in the sense that I'm married to a cradle Catholic. Although he might with more justice say that he's Anglican adjacent, given that, you know, we all attend the local Anglican church. So I'm not sure which one of us is more adjacent to which. I mean, this is an enormously complicated thing. I have a kind of ambivalent relationship with Anglicanism in the sense that it is kind of to blame for liberalism. You know, liberalism is kind of the Reformation's fault in a fairly obvious way. And, you know, as such, you know, logically, from the perspective of somebody who thinks liberalism has created as many problems as it solved, you know, you might seem to follow from that a better standing point from which to think about those questions would be to be not an Anglican. You know, so certainly if we had a local Catholic church, if the walking distance parish church were Catholic, not Anglican, I'd be very happily attending that, on my husband's terrain rather than he attending ours on mine. I mean, as things stand, weekly practicing Christianity rather than the Christmas and Easter variety is such a minority thing that I suspect we probably have more in common across high Anglican and Catholic faiths than we do separating us. I know once you get into fine points of doctrine, there's a long and bitter history of disagreement, but we are where we are.
Indeed, yeah. That's something that came up in my conversation with Giles as well, Giles Fraser, where he was I think it's fair to say, I hope I'm not misrepresenting, but kind of pinning some of the individualistic assumptions of liberalism on the Reformation. And personally, I kind of resist that. I suppose as someone who's in the Reformed tradition, I can see trajectories that are there. I suppose with Lutheranism and the emphasis on the by faith alone, the individual assuming kind of faith in Christ as an individual. But I mean, I think that's an important corrective, personally, to some of the strands within Catholicism that were there. But also, I think, and I don't know how eccentric this view is, but I sort of see Calvin as a communitarian, as someone who was trying to establish a polity that was sort of scripturally based.
And, spicy take. Well, certainly the Bruderhof would agree to that. I mean, they're as I said, as Suzanne described them, all Anabaptists.
Well, Calvin and the Anabaptists had a pretty rough relationship, sadly. I think, I mean, I sort of see this strand of radical individualism as being a kind of post-Calvinist, post-Reformational development.
Yeah, I mean, I see it straightforwardly in terms of the antinomian heresy, or some elements of it. Look to me like a sort of modern day update of sort of mashup of Pelagian and antinomian heresies. On the one hand, you've got the perfectibility of man, and this idea that you can pursue that on earth, which seems ridiculous to me.
Well, what we just said.
And sort of prone to leave us with a multitude of abominations, but also the antinomian heresy, which is the idea that this idea that you can have this absolutely immediate direct relationship with God, and the existence of that absolutely immediate direct relationship with God justifies you in doing basically whatever the hell you like. And this sort of radical individualist kind of sacralization of individual desire and individual realization is just that minus the God bit. Or at least it sort of resituated the divine in human will and human desire. I think
that's very interesting.
It's no coincidence really that modern Satanism, in as much as it has a theology, comes straight out of the antinomian tradition. And arguably modern libertarianism comes straight out of Satanism, which is, and it's kind of comic when you think about it, that the Satanists, in their modern variant, are really just libertarian. They're really just libertarians. But then you think, oh, is that all Satanists are? And then you think, wait a minute, how many Satanists? So that's kind of an unsettling line of thought. But I mean, sort of talking about genealogies of modern liberalism. I mean, the Pelagian heresy obviously long precedes the Reformation, so we'll sort of park that one. But the outworking of antinomianism in a kind of de-Christianized individualism, I think is a very underexplored aspect of liberalism. Just sort of going back to the Catholics for a moment, you asked why do I consider myself Catholic adjacent? And actually this relates to my interest in reconstructing a politics out with or after radical freedom, in the sense that it's no coincidence that post-liberal politics owes a lot to Catholic social teaching. Even Maurice Glassman, who is not a Catholic, and comes from quite a different religious heritage, is, it explicitly says that his Blue Labour thinking is heavily influenced by Catholic social teaching, and an enormous number of influential post-liberal thinkers are Catholics, and it's just not at all amazing when you consider that Catholic social teaching is pretty much the only well worked out body of thought that remains. It's the only vantage point left pretty much from which to critique the sort of hegemonic liberalism. So it just isn't that weird that that there should be this strong relationship between Catholicism and the sort of post-liberal politics. That said, I'm acutely ambivalent about this, because I just think it's too early to tell. If there was, you'll forgive the phrasing, in a cage fight between hegemonic liberalism and Catholicism, I just don't know who would win. I think that they're doing their best not to kind of have to square up outside the pub at the moment. But there's several billion Catholics, but there's also several billion liberals, and it's just too early to tell which one of them is going to win out. In a sense, the Reformation is still ongoing. Yeah. I think we must be into the counter Reformation by now, but that sort of that contest is still ongoing, and I don't really know whether an explicitly professing Christian faith is going to be enough to recuperate those people whose faiths and whose moral outlooks have been dissolved into radical individualism. I don't think it's enough, and that sounds like a bleak and pessimistic standpoint for somebody who is a professing and a practicing Christian. But I think, if we're going to find a way forward that can bring radical individualists together with people of faith, I don't think just converting people by the sword is really going to cut the mustard. Maybe it will. I don't know. Maybe actually I'm just not being courageous enough or something. I don't know. But I don't think it has I don't think the prognosis for just conversion by the sword is really that great. Also, and this is something I'm writing on at the moment. It's my view that we are now living once again under an integral moral order. There's a lively, a small but influential body of political thought, very online political thought, again amongst the Catholics, that argues for integralism, or sort of neo-integralism, and some quite interesting writing around bringing the moral and the political back together in a kind of integrated moral order under natural law. And while I like the idea in principle, I think my response to it is America in particular, and to an extent also Britain, are already living under an integralism. It's just not the one the Catholics want. It's what I call an integralism of the self, which is, it sort of sacralizes individual self-actualization, over and above the natural limits of our bodies, or our capabilities, or whatever, builds up an infrastructure, with the aim of, supporting that radical self-realization, and firmly censors anybody who challenges the idea that there might be natural limits to anybody's radical self-realization. That is now the moral order that we live under. It is an integral moral order. It has the full weight of hegemonic political, economic, and religious, in the sense of media and culture, forces behind it.
Yeah, pretty solidly, doesn't it?
Yeah, it meshes together pretty solidly. And I'm not going to name particular political events recently, because all of them are fairly hotly contested. But I think it's fairly clear to observers that we do live now under an integral political and moral order.
I mean, as you've written, there's religious sentiment. If it gets dammed up, it will break out in some way or another. This actually brings me on quite nicely to my next question, which draws on perhaps more of the political side of things. And you've written very powerfully, I think, and very thoughtfully, and put forward a challenge to liberalism in your work. and its core tenet that, you know, individual self-realization is the goal of life and must be pursued ruthlessly at the cost of everything else. You've applied this particularly in your work to feminism, liberal feminism in particular, and it seems to me personally that liberal feminism, and I'm sure you'd agree with this, made and continues to make great gains by advancing the rights of women to individual self-realization. But if we accept that this critique that you've made of liberal feminism and its core doctrine applies to both men and women, I wondered if you could talk here about the sources, some of the experiences, the traditions, the ideas, and particularly where these are consonant with the Christian tradition, how these have influenced your thinking and the convictions that you've come to on this.
I could probably write 10,000 words just about that. Taking those in order as much as I can. What brought me up short on the subject of individual freedom was becoming a mother. You know, because there's the point you become pregnant, your freedom is constrained in some ways that you've actively and very intentionally signed up for if you're doing your best to get pregnant. But that pull very sharply against this idea of each of us as an autonomous being, because you live literally in symbiosis with another human for 9 months, and then, you know, effectively in symbiosis with another human for a long time after that. Breastfeeding is a symbiotic experience, you know, in actually much more subtle ways than just the obvious physical one of needing to feed your child. You know, I'd often wake up a few seconds before my daughter woke up wanting a feed, and, you know, even if she was in another room. You know, I have friends who report getting a milk let down at the point where their child needed feeding, even if that child was physically at the childminders, you know, a couple of miles away. You know, doesn't happen to everybody, but it happens. You know, there's a symbiosis which is very profound. And in the context of that experience, I felt like the account of all of us as, you know, radically, as foundationally separate, you know, in the way that was envisaged by, say, Locke or Hobbes, just is not an adequate account of what humans are or how we relate. You know, another piece, I suppose, of the puzzle is my loss of faith in progress. I call myself, slightly flippantly, I call myself a progress atheist. I think, you know, not believing in progress renders one an atheist, not in the sense of, not in the sort of modern sense of slightly annoying person who drones on about Richard Dawkins, but in the sort of, you know, that maybe the 17th century sense of moral dropout. You know, not believing in progress makes you very, very deeply at odds with the modern world and with some of its sort of basic moral assumptions. But I never stopped believing in feminism, because it's not as though women's bodies stop. It's not as though women stop being female just because you don't believe in progress. And even though progress, or a belief in progress, and feminist activism have always been very closely related, or at least for as long as we've had anything that could be recognized as feminism as such, I don't think they are inextricable, or at least I don't think they should be inextricable. I don't think it makes no sense to me that just because I've stopped believing in progress, I should stop thinking women have political interests, because of course we do. You know, we did before they invented feminism, and we will long after feminism has been consigned to history. So for me, the question is something along the line: if I don't believe in progress, what does it mean to argue for women's interests? And I mean, that's an immensely complicated question, because it really depends on where you stand. It depends on your class, it depends on your context, it depends to an extent even on your climate. But the irreducible commonality of, you know, women as such is our reproductive role. You know, and I know there are liberal feminisms that challenge that view and say, well, you know, there are some women can't have babies, does that mean they're not women? But that I think that's more of a sort of wrecking amendment than it is a constructive contribution to the debate, because what I'm interested in is the norm, the generality, what mostly describes people. The majority of women still have children, and the majority of women still encounter assumptions and social structures which turn on the sort of general understanding that women have children. You know, and that's the terrain in which women have political interests as such. I mean, there's of course the related domain of sex and sexuality and desire, But that in itself is, is fairly obviously connected to, the question of women's reproductive role.
The point that you make about gestation and the act of gestation, childbirth, child rearing, to me, it seems to apply just so much more generally to social relations, to men and women. There's actually a really, to me, it seems really consonant with the Christian understanding of mutuality.
Yes, absolutely.
The fact
absolutely.
that we rely on one another, that we exist for one another, and to me that applies just as much to men as to women.
Absolutely. I think it's, I start from the experience of motherhood simply because it's a way of concretizing something which is actually true of all humans. It's very obviously the case that I don't just, as a pregnant woman, I'm not currently pregnant, but the experience of being a pregnant woman is to experience very, very literally and very physically, not just belonging to yourself, but and the idea that we belong to ourselves is sort of foundational to the idea of liberalism and the idea of individual freedom and so on. It's baked into a number of assumptions and a number of political campaigns and a number of sort of emancipatory ideas. But this idea that we belong only to ourselves is obviously precarious. If you're a woman who has a child, because the moment I'm pregnant, I don't just belong to myself. I can't drink a bottle of vodka and pass out. Well, I mean, I can, but it's a deeply wrong thing to do, because I might actually kill my unborn child in the process, etc. and so on. It's obvious that we know that we don't just belong to ourselves, and I start from that point. But as you say, it very clearly applies well beyond that. We belong to each other as well. And you can generalize that to the intimate relationships you have with the people around you. The long-term commitment you make to your spouse, for example. Within the context of that relationship, it's very clear that you don't just belong to yourself. And if you approach a marriage, from the perspective of I just belong to myself, it very quickly becomes a sort of tit for tat, zero-sum game. And then frankly, the marriage just probably, the prognosis probably isn't good for the relationship in the long term. And you have to start foundationally from the premise that you belong to each other. Of course, that's it doesn't follow from that you only ever do what the other person wants. But so starting from the perspective that you have to take the other person's needs and interests into account, is pretty much sort of staying married 101.
Yeah. And
you can generalize that again beyond immediate family life to the needs and interests of your community, and so on and so on and so on. So yeah, I mean,
I think it's very powerful, as you say, embodiment of a broader principle. Society.
Yeah.
I wanted to move on.
So just to wrap up that thought, if mine is illiberal feminism, I slightly jokingly call it reactionary feminism, as a way of acknowledging my rejection of progress as necessarily a component in feminism, which rules out conservatism as well, because conservatism is just progress done a bit slower.
That's interesting.
So I joke about mine being a reactionary feminism, because I just want out of the whole progress story, which probably isn't possible, but I'm sure as anything going to try. But reactionary feminism really, I see it as applying as a political stance which applies well beyond just women, and as being rooted, as I said, in the idea that we belong to one another. And that applies every bit as much to men and to the relations between men and women as it does to the relationship between a mother and a dependent child.
Great. Yeah, that brings me quite nicely to my next question, which is getting at perhaps defining postliberalism a bit more. You've spoken about postliberalism as a term, perhaps being a bit naff, perhaps being a bit vacuous. And I wanted to look here a bit more about the relationship between small c conservatism and post-liberalism. You've written in one of your pieces about cultural Christianity, you write, quote, "When there's nothing solid to go back to, anyone attracted to what is left of the ideology that used to be called conservative needs to find a new name for their yearning. Constructionists, perhaps. There is a lot of building to do." So my question here is, clearly there's a substantive difference to you between post-liberalism and conservatism. I'm wondering, what that is and what this reconstructionism kind of looks like a bit more in depth.
In as much as there's a distinction between post-liberalism and conservatism, and I'm not going to opine too much about that, for the simple reason that post-liberalism is still such an open space. It's a placeholder, really, for an ideology that everybody's busy trying to cobble together behind the scenes and in frenzied DM arguments on Twitter and podcasts such as this and so on. We are part of that process right now. So I'm not going to presume to offer the last word on what post-liberalism is. I think it has a deep affinity to conservatism in the sense of having a relationship with the past, for the simple reason that if you've come out the other side of radically dissolving everything, including our relationship to the past, it's not unreasonable to go back to what we remember of our past. Try and cobble together something, because otherwise there's a sense of just being adrift in this sort of sloshing miasma of valueless values in which everything is somehow equal and nothing is forbidden, and the world is dissolving into nightmares as a result. So in that sense, it's difficult to avoid having a relation to conservatism, but in as much as conservatism is itself part of the liberal tradition, it's an uncomfortable relationship. I mean, as there's the classic epithet, people standing on top of history yelling stop. But even just baked into that phrase is the idea of history as something which rolls on and has its onward march, which is the same conception of history as the one Owen Jones mobilizes when he talks about people being on the wrong side of history.
You're saying it's still interested in progress, but just slower.
Yes, yeah. Conservatives, broadly speaking, are still have entirely swallowed the right side of history Kool-Aid. They just like it all to go a bit more slowly.
Could I push you on this a bit more, because particularly on the role of progress in society, because you've written that liberalism is a doctrine that gives a good account of human society only if you airbrush out all states of dependence. Surely there's something good there in the doctrine of progress and the idea that civil rights movements, movements for minorities, these have all, many are net beneficiaries of these movements today.
Sure, I suppose my take on progress isn't that it doesn't happen. It's just that all social, but it's more that I question the idea that humans are in some absolute sense indefinably better now than we were, say, 2,000 years ago. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. There are things about the way society is now that I would not want to see rolled back. I've no desire to be the property of my husband or my father, for example, or not to have the right to vote. These are all things that I welcome and am immensely grateful for. But do they represent progress in some absolute sense? I don't think so. Because they come with trade-offs as well. So it's not as though things don't change, and it's not as though human cultures and human consciousnesses don't evolve. Just sort of according to their own internal logic. This is a process which goes rapidly or very slowly, just sort of depending on what the idea or the cultural current is. It's not as if that doesn't happen. We have a radically different way of seeing the world now than, say, the ancient Phoenicians. That's fairly self-evident. But are we better than them? I see no way of establishing that without defining better in terms which already sort of clear the pitch in our favor. Are we richer? Probably. Are we healthier? Depends how you look at it. Are we happier? It depends how you define happy and who you're measuring. So my take on progress is not that change doesn't occur, oh, that some elements of it aren't desirable. It's more that, you know, all of those changes come with trade-offs, and I don't think things get better in some sort of absolute sense.
Yeah. This brings,
so, you know, if I were to pick any given trajectory, for example, you know, the women's rights and women's freedom, since we're talking about feminism, you know, certainly, you know, things are a lot better in some respects for women now than they were, say, 300 years ago. But in some respects, they, you know, you could equally argue that they're worse. You know, and I don't think this is, you know, I'm not arguing for a sort of, you know, a messy relativism so much as just a degree of pragmatism about, you know, what it is that we're choosing to push politically, and a recognition that sometimes those things can come with costs, and that sometimes, you know, those costs accumulate to the point where we need to count them and wonder about changing direction.
I mean, this raises the question, I guess, of values, doesn't it?
Yes.
And that segues quite nicely into my next question, which deals with another one of your pieces that I've reread this week in preparing for this, which is on blasphemy law.
Oh yes.
You talk about hate crime legislation as a kind of new blasphemy laws, and blasphemy law for the listener are those laws that punish a lack of reverence for God or some sacred values. And in your piece on hate legislation as blasphemy law, you imply, I think, that we almost actually need some sort of legal fiction or agreement as a society on the values that we share and protect. I just wonder, so you write the following, quote, "Hate crime is not blasphemy, but from a humanist perspective on the nature of religion, laws prohibiting hate speech serve a similar purpose to the now abolished ones governing blasphemy. They just serve a different set of values." So my question here is, what values do we need to be talking about as a society?
Perhaps that fundamentally is the question of reconstruction. You know, what values do we need to be talking about? Mm. That's an absolutely massive question. And I suppose, again, I can only really start from, I suppose my starting point in trying to address that would probably be that we need to attend to the natural world. And in the natural world, I include humans. You know, I don't think it's true that humans don't have a nature and that we can just fashion ourselves in any form that we want to. This is transparently not the case. I mean, I often come back to the experience of motherhood, just because it so elegantly and eloquently concretizes some of the blind spots in the worldview that we currently have. It's, you know, we recognize that, you know, you can't teach a baby to play chess. You know, a baby has a nature and a normal developmental path. You know, teething normally happens at a certain age. Walking and talking normally happen somewhere around 12 months. You know, people recognize that if a child has got to the age of 3 and still isn't walking and talking, then maybe something's up. You know, these are all sort of things that are generally understood as being in the nature of babies, or in the nature of children as they develop. But there's somehow this sort of amata about, I don't even know how you pronounce that word, there's a sort of collective silence about the possibility that there may be sort of normative patterns like that apply to humans as adults, or to humans in the social domain. This is something that we shy away from as being just too politically spicy. And yet, you know, there's plenty of very solid evidence that there are small but significant differences, for example, in personality between the sexes. You know, it shouldn't be forbidden to talk about that. You know, there are also some people are just more naturally gifted, and sometimes even across the board than others. But acknowledging that and looking at the patterns of what people are like, and looking at, what there is and what there might be that we can say with reasonable confidence about what human nature is, and, you know, what we normally are or want or need or can be expected to do, is is incredibly dangerous, not just because it pulls against this idea that we can all be whoever and whatever we want to be, but also because it invites back in conversations about hierarchy and violence, and what politics looks like when it's conducted between people who are irreducibly asymmetrical. I mean, going back again to parenting, there's a today sort of fairly influential kind of liberal school of parenting that tries to make the relationship between parents and their children as egalitarian as possible. And there are some, but again, there are no atheists in foxholes, and even the most liberal parent will yank their toddler out of the road if they run into it and there's a bus coming. So the benign exercise of absolute parental authority, benign despotism just has a place in parenting life, and it's you make life extremely difficult for yourself as a mother if you don't recognize that.
Yeah, I saw you'd written about this in relation to TV programs at Bing.
Oh yes, you can't make me get in the bath. No, actually I can. Actually, I picked her up and I put her in the bath, because honestly, some forms of extending personal freedom to your preschool child just are crazy.
Yeah, I mean, you make the point in that piece on hate legislation that laws essentially prize individual self-expression and the right to freedom of speech. And Giles actually talked a bit about this as liberty as a cuckoo value.
Yes. And
I pressed him on it because I think liberty is very important. And he said, yes, it's part of a basket of values. You make the point that the laws actually need to sort of prioritize a common good.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, bringing the point about putting your toddler in the bath back to the question of hate crime legislation, it's actually a good, it's a good analogy for what I'm talking about there. For a society to be able to function, as you say, you need a reasonably well understood common set of values, and you need to be able to enforce those. And it is legitimate to enforce those. You can't have a society in which absolute free speech is permitted. It just won't work, because sooner or later somebody will say something which is destructive to the common functioning of your society. Therefore, whether your shared moral values are sacralization of the self, or whether they're sort of broadly Christian framework, you have to be able to police the outer boundaries of what people can and can't say.
That's very challenging for those on the right, isn't it? Who want
yes.
to say that. Yeah.
It is, and I mean, this actually goes back to the point I was making previously about the extent to which conservatives are really just liberals, with they're liberal individualists who don't care so much about the poor. I mean, I'm being a bit unfair there, but some of them really do look a bit like that.
I wanted to just a couple more questions, and one segues into this idea of society. We've talked a little bit there about sort of liberal society as something that has an absence of values, and yet you've also written quite a bit about society being highly religious, this religiosity that is taking off in various movements over the past few years, and that we should take this seriously. You've talked about this in the context of various events and movements, and coming back to this quote that, like water that's been dammed, the religious impulse has found new channels. And so I just wonder if you could speak to the present moment being a kind of opportunity to explore our values. It seems that this is as good a time as any to do that. Would you agree with that?
I suppose you could say that that's exactly what we are doing. In whether, I mean, Tara Isabella Burton has written an interesting book on the redistribution of religiosity, if you like, in American culture, in themes as diverse as, I think she writes about fitness culture, for example, as a sort of pseudo religion, and various other phenomena which have taken on the character of the book is Strange Rites, that have taken on a sort of pseudo religious character, even in direct proportion to the way formal adherence to Christianity of one form or another has declined in America. That is to say, religiosity, the sum total of religiosity is much the same as it was before. It just isn't. It is just less formalized. I mean, it's interesting that the point where Christianity in America really began to decline is the very same point that spiritualism took off in earnest in the 19th century, and the energy that had previously gone into sort of Christian enthusiasm. I use enthusiast here in the 16th century sense of the sort of the more theological sense. The point where religious enthusiasm as such started to wane in the Christian sense, a huge amount of that energy went into various health reform movements and into movements like spiritualism. People became very keen on hydropathy and vegetarianism and various other sort of, at the time, quite radical ideas, and put every bit as much sort of faith energy into that as they had done into Christianity. I mean, I think you can certainly make the case that that's just part and parcel of what I was talking about before. Human nature. I disagree profoundly with people like Richard Dawkins, who imagine that all we have to do is abolish formal religion and humans will all suddenly become sort of rational, fact-seeking weighers of the evidence. And well, put it this way, recent events do not support that thesis. And if you were even a fraction as sort of evidence-based as he claims to be, he'd probably be revising his thesis by now.
Yeah, agreed on that. Absolutely.
Which argues perhaps for the presence of faith even in the mindset of people like Richard Dawkins, who are the strongest in arguing against it. So but how that applies to the present moment in the sense of exploring our own values is a more difficult question, because as things stand, we are, as I said before, we are already living under a new moral integralism, and it's one which explicitly disavows the idea of common values, because it has to. It disavows the idea of a human nature, and it disavows the idea of common values because it has to, in the interests of facilitating radical individuation. So in a sense, it's a very paradoxical sort of a moral order, because it's a moral order which disavows the existence of itself in a very strange way, which probably goes some way to explaining why so many people find it as unsettling as they do.
Yes.
But how we go about suffusing that really quite bare and inhuman skeleton with something which has more life and more sort of context and more sort of is more amenable to a human scale life and richer interpersonal relations is a difficult question. I mean, I think for me, just to bring it right back to the beginning of the conversation, that speaks to why I decided, despite my very ambivalent relationship to the Anglican faith, why I decided that attending church was an important thing to do. In a sense, it almost doesn't matter where you start. You have to pick a place and stick to it and make a commitment. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're not completely sure whether you've met the one or not. If the two of you decided to pick a place, if you're not sure whether your small town is perfect, pick a place and stick to it. And the act of making that commitment and turning up on a regular basis will suffuse it with meaning in a way which serves to create the values which we've been spending the last 3 centuries doing our best to destroy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So when I talk about reconstruction, I think it's a very personal. It's something which begins at a very personal and very small scale interpersonal level. And the foundational act is to pick a place. Whether that's an emotional place in the sense of long-term committed relationships, or whether it's a physical place in the sense of wherever you happen to be that feels like a good place to stop, you have to pick a place and stick to it.
That makes sense. I think referring to an earlier conversation, Giles brought up The Magnificent Seven as a film which actually my wife and I watched last week. That's I think a very powerful metaphor for that, of the cowboy as a eternal drifter that never settles, and never covenants himself to a place, and therefore is essentially kind of empty and never settles. I wonder, just if we could bring it to a close with kind of drawing everything together. And my concluding question, which I've been trying to reframe, looks at the public conversations that we have around politics, particularly as people of faith, as Christians. So my question is kind of twofold. So what perhaps do you think as Christians, what perhaps can Christians learn from the post-liberal movement? And what do you think Christians can offer to it? Offer to perhaps post-liberalism or reconstructionism, as you've put it?
I wouldn't presume to tell Christians what they can learn from a movement that's still as diffuse as post-liberalism. So I'm afraid I'm just going to duck that one. What can post-liberal politics learn from Christianity? The first two things that spring to mind, and I'm going to have to think through out loud what I mean by them, are indirection and metaphor. I've been thinking a lot in the context of our new integralism of the self about Leo Strauss's famous essay on persecution and the art of writing, in which he draws a connection between works, literary works or essays, which contain double meanings, and the social contexts in which they were written, in which a very strong and oppressive moral order prevailed. And he argues that it's not. I mean, I'm paraphrasing very crudely here, but it's not that people stopped writing under repressive orders. It's not that people stopped dissenting or conveying esoteric ideas under very, very repressive moral orders. It's more that they became subtler about expressing them. I think if we're heading in a direction where some of the questions that post-liberalism asks are discouraged under an integralism of the self, then we're going to have to get better at indirection. And we have an enormous amount to learn on both sides of that question from Christianity, which has, after all, been 2,000 years worth of creative dissent and sometimes repression of that dissent. And elsewhere, as part of that question, there's an enormous richness in the heritage of Christian writing when it comes to conveying deep moral truths in metaphor. Then there's an astonishingly rich allegorical tradition, a continuation of the classical allegorical tradition, and under Christian humanism, of weaving the two together, that produces this incredibly rich, sort of concatenating, echoing across time and space of allegorical meanings. And I think if we're going to work on a poetics of indirection beyond sort of alt-right meme culture on the web, then we would do well to explore that tradition. So in as much as from the perspective of dissident writing, I think there's a lot that post-liberalism can learn from the Christian tradition, but also much more concretely. I've already referenced Catholic social teaching, and I think that's whether or not you agree with all aspects of it, and whether or not you're a professing Catholic, there's an immense amount just in the Catholic anthropology, if you like, the pre-Reformation, the Thomists, and that extraordinarily rich medieval anthropologies. There's a huge amount of undiscovered treasure there, and also in political, post-democratic political thinking. I mean, this isn't really something that we've had a chance to get onto, but it's my view that an integralism of the self, it follows from an integralism of the self that we're leaving the age of democracy. I mean, we'll just have to do that one another time.
That's quite a statement.
Right, exactly. But I'm just going to drop that one there right at the end of this discussion, and say, if we're going to do that in some sort of, in any sort of a human way, we might usefully look at, for example, the Mirror of Princes literary tradition. Again, there are enormous riches in writers like Giles of Rome, who was writing in, I believe, the 13th century, thinking through, the moral, the proper moral relationships between the ruler and ruled. I mean, again, you might not agree with everything that Giles of Rome says, but some of it you read today and you think, well, it wouldn't hurt if the tech oligarchs read some of this.
Right. Yeah.
So I think, if post-liberalism is going to exist as anything other than, sort of outright opposition to the age that we're currently entering, but, perhaps as a sort of an enriching, but if it has any potential as an enriching force, it's in drawing on some of those traditions in a constructive way so as to rehumanize a political direction of travel, which right now I see as potentially taking us into an age of nightmares. And in that, we can learn an enormous amount from Christian heritage.
Thank you. I think that's very, very well put. And there's a strong vocabulary, I think, that's being crafted around re-enchantment and rehumanization, and that challenges some of the dehumanizing trajectories that we're seeing in current society. So yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for those reflections, and thanks for taking the time. I think we can end there.
Thank you for having me.